no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
Will is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. This is Will Communications Director Pat Garrett, and joining me as always is our co-host, Will President Rick Esenberg. Thanks for joining us for another great episode. Last time we discussed how modern politics has changed the way Congress operates. Give that episode a listen if you haven't. Now today we're talking about something else that has changed a lot in the last few decades, the now infamous Wisconsin Supreme Court elections. There's an election coming up on April 7th, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but mainly how these races have changed over time. So our guest today is Brian Reisinger, an author and communications consultant who has worked at the highest levels of Wisconsin policy and political battles. Brian is also the author of the book Land Rich and Cash Poor, which dives into the challenges facing rural America and our farmers. Brian is also the CEO of Platform Communications, and they do some great work for us at Will. And so we're just excited to have Brian on for a conversation not related to media work.
Good to be with you.
So thanks everyone for joining. I think the first question here, honestly, Brian, is, we've talked about this, these Supreme Court races, they get a lot of national attention. This one is just a little quieter than I think what we're used to. And we'll talk about last year's, but why do you think why do you think like Fox News isn't barreling down the door to talk to you today?
Yeah, I think this one is a little bit of an anomaly. It's a little bit of a calm after a storm and maybe before a storm to come. And what I mean by that is I think that the left and the media, look at this and they say, well, the majority isn't at stake, so there's a little bit lower stakes. I think they also think that they have it in the bag. The left thinks that they have it in the bag. That's never a good thing to do. That's never a smart thing to do in politics, to believe you've got it won. Conservatives have done that at different times and it's cost them. Liberals, I think, are doing that now. In any case, whatever the outcome of this race, because the majority isn't at stake directly with this race and because the left thinks they've got it, this one's a little quieter. I don't think that changes the overall big picture trends that you guys are rightly wanting to talk about here, the polarization, the nationalization of these elections. Wisconsin is still the top battleground state in the country. And anytime there is a reason for our Supreme Court race to matter, as there has been so many times over the past decade, the Supreme Court races in Wisconsin will pop as a major national flashpoint again. This one is maybe going to be a little bit of a lull in that trend, but it's not going to undo that trend.
Rick, before you got on, I was telling Brian, I was like, it'll be so funny. I'll go years without talking to a reporter, and I may have worked with them in a different state. And all of a sudden I'll get a phone call and they'll just be like, hey, I got assigned to the Wisconsin, and this is a national reporter for the context. Like, this is not a Milwaukee reporter. And it's, I got assigned to the Wisconsin Supreme Court election. I'm actually heading out to Milwaukee in a couple of weeks. Like, walk me through what I need to know. It's kind of just crazy. There's not a lot of local races that determine this or that drive this, that get this much attention. And I guess, for someone like you who follows these races and have over many years, like, is that a good thing? It's probably a bad thing.
There's an old saw about judicial elections from many, many years ago in which somebody said they were like playing a game of checkers by mail, right? They were very boring because there was a certain mutually assumed decorum, set of rules about what you could say. You were supposed to be judicial. You were supposed to be lawyer-like. You were supposed to at least give lip service to the idea that you were applying the law and not choosing your own policy preferences. And because of that, there wasn't a great deal of interest in these races, and they did tend to revolve around claims of legal competence and experience and things like that. That wasn't always the case in every election, but it was generally the case. That came to change, and I think it's all kind of summed up in Justice Scalia's old adage that nobody cared about us here at the United States Supreme Court when they thought we were doing lawyers' work. When they thought we were interpreting contracts and reading statutes with an eye to what they say and rather what we'd like them to say. And that has changed. There's a lot of interest in the nomination of Supreme Court justices, the nomination of Federal Court of Appeals judges, and a lot of interest in these races. When the public comes to believe, as it has, that the courts, and in particular the Wisconsin Supreme Court, is going to make major policy decisions about, our common life, then people are going to want to be heard. And the way they get heard is to spend a lot of money and to make the kind of appeals that will move voters. And voters generally are not going to be moved by the kind of thing that lawyers like me care about. And Pat, I feel sorry for Pat and Brian to some extent working with us, because you have to sit through the way lawyers like me think. Well, voters are looking for something else, and these elections have become way more salient, and they become way more focused on policy outcomes. And so, yeah, this one is a little bit more quiet. I think it's because the left thinks, actually, both sides may think the left has it in the bag, because the money just isn't there. You don't have the nonstop campaigning. We'll see if that turns out to be right. The last time this happened, actually, was a surprise outcome. The conservative candidate won. But I agree with Brian, and this, like, once this genie gets out of the bottle, it's kind of hard to put it back in.
Yeah, I don't know how you put the genie back in the bottle, honestly. Brian, I don't know if you have any ideas, but that's a
Yeah, I mean there's so many elements to the genie having gotten out that are kind of beyond our immediate control. I mean, there's the question of how to actually select judges, which is a whole other discussion and something Rick has a lot more expertise on. But I'll just say, I think that kind of that historical look Rick was talking about is really important, because there are national forces and then there are also decisions that were made here in Wisconsin. The national forces are, of course, the increased polarization, the increased massive money machine, particularly the money machine on the left that's been coming into Wisconsin increasingly in the past couple elections. But there are also, points at which campaigns made decisions to kind of move on from talking about jurisprudence and how to interpret the law and what our judges' role should be, to talking about political values. People who remember Tim Burns a decade ago, back in 2016, he was a liberal Supreme Court judicial candidate who lost in the primary, but he was one of the first candidates really articulating his political values in a really out loud way. He was kind of a precursor to what, Janet Protasiewicz and others were doing later out in the wide open, right? So it's big forces beyond our control. It's also steps that different campaigns and candidates have taken to try to appeal to those voters.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that this reflects really an evolution in legal thinking, and it's not a recent development. It certainly was well underway when I trained a long time ago. And the idea is that it's a disagreement about legal reasoning and what the law is. And the progressive left legal project has generally been about stripping away what they see as a bunch of subterfuge, about just applying the law, and sort of realizing that language can be manipulated by smart lawyers, and that really applying the law is all about power. It's all about making policy choices. And this is not a bad thing, and this is a good thing. And so, we had an opinion a couple of years ago in a case that was the concurrence written by, Justice Rebecca Dallett, who basically said, well, we have this open-ended provision in the Wisconsin Constitution about equality, and it's broader than the Equal Protection Clause of the federal Constitution, and it basically means whatever we say it means. So this would give judges the power to superintend legislative and executive choices in a relatively unencumbered way. And there are people who think that's a good thing. I don't. But when you have courts that act in that way, then it's just inevitable that people are going to want to elect judges who they think will come out the right way, who will agree with them on policy choices, when, traditionally that's not what judges were supposed to do. The policy choices were to be made by the legislature and the governor, and the courts were empowered to resolve disputes about the application of those policy choices, but not to remake them themselves, to be, in some sense, faithful to the choices that legislators and governors had made within their separate spheres and try to implement them rather than modify them.
Another thing I wanted to talk about is this idea that, this was enshrined in the state's founding, right? The Supreme Court election came out in the Constitution, or was it amended? Or, I mean, just Rick, what's that historical?
We've always elect judges. You can sort of look through the United States based upon the date of statehood. So judges, state court judges are more likely to be appointed out east. They're more likely to be elected in the Midwest, and then there's a combination of all sorts of ways that they do it as you move west of here. So we've always elected judges, and while there are people that are very critical of electing judges, Dick Posner, who was a sort of a curmudgeonly judge on the Seventh Circuit until relatively recently, he was famous for saying, "Well, why should we elect judges? We don't elect physicists. How can the public really assess, legal competence?" And you can have that argument, but it's not going to change. I've been involved in projects that did polling on, whether people would give up the right to elect judges for some type of appointed system, maybe something like what the federal government does. And there's absolutely no support for that in the state. I mean, the people of the state of Wisconsin wouldn't even give up electing the treasurer. If they're not going to give up electing the treasurer, who I guarantee you 98% of the public couldn't, maybe more than 98% couldn't identify the fellow's name, they're not going to give up electing Supreme Court justices and other judges.
I do think, though, the current system has kind of created this kind of voter participation maybe deficit between a couple different groups of people. And actually, maybe it's existed for a long time, and we're only now noticing it now because of the political alignment. And so, Brian, talk about who votes in these elections, why that matters, and why that possibly informs what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's kind of one of the great ironies of Supreme Court elections. I think what Rick said about the history is exactly right. It's important for people to understand, and there really isn't a reason the voters would see to have that power taken away from them. One of the ironies of the spring election, though, is that it is a very small electorate, right? So in April, when you get voters coming out, they're not coming out also for Senate races and governor's races or presidential races. So oftentimes the Supreme Court race is the big race in the spring. And because the Supreme Court is somewhat of a smaller race relative to those other races, the turnout is low. So those spring elections have really low turnout. When you have really low turnout, the types of voters you tend to get are the most activated base voters of both parties. In other words, you got your most hardcore conservatives and your most hardcore liberals who come out. So ironically, in this world where we're talking about, how there ought to be, at least some of what we're arguing is that there ought to be consideration of qualifications and legal philosophy, and not only political values, you've got in many ways your most partisan voters coming out in those Supreme Court elections. So we're in this kind of interesting jam where the low turnout means your most most politically activated voters on the left and the right, even though it's kind of an election that we, in some worlds might like to have be a little bit less politically motivated. So it's kind of an interesting bind that we're in that way.
The irony is you use the term irony, Brian, and that's exactly the word, because these elections, the judicial elections and the election for state superintendent of public instruction, were explicitly moved to the spring by constitutional amendment at the turn of the 19th to 20th century because they wanted them to be less partisan. and I don't think anybody would look at either one of those races now and say that they're not partisan.
That's a whoops of history.
Yeah, it's insane to say that out loud, even just no, these are specifically done in April so that politics doesn't play a role. And it's these have become the most political kind of canary in the coal mine for the midterms. I mean, and this is where I want to go to the last year's midterm, or not, I even said midterm, last year's Supreme Court election, right? Where we saw, it was Elon Musk getting involved in all sorts of different ways with how he was spending money. Obviously, the left has tons of very well-off donors that have been funding this. The political parties in the state become a conduit to basically bring money into the state as well, because there are some sort of limits, I think, on how you can donate directly to a candidate. And so it's it was like anything we've never seen before last year. I feel like last year was far worse. And I don't know if the two of you guys agree with that or not.
Yeah, the race last year between Susan Crawford and Brad Schimmel was the most expensive Supreme Court race in the history of the country, not just Wisconsin, the history of the country. And this was a situation where we saw all the ingredients that we've been talking about in part here come together, right? Supreme Court candidates being either liberated or forced, depending upon how they look at it, to talk about their political values. The massive money machine that the left has been setting up. The right had, for a while, especially in the Walker years, had fundraising and infrastructure figured out. The left was coming back at that time and has built that out in a big way. They've got the infrastructure. They have a massive national money machine. They have convinced most of their national donors that not only does Wisconsin matter, but races like the Wisconsin Supreme Court race matter. And so they're really printing money in many, many ways. And so all of these forces combined with national polarization and everything else going on in our politics were really on full display in 2025. We saw different ingredients of them from kind of 2016, I would say, onward over the course of the past decade, some of them even earlier. But by the time we got to 2025 with Crawford versus Schimmel, you're seeing all of these ingredients basically in full doses.
Full disclosure, I was at the state Republican Party in 2016, and like obviously, like there was a preference of ours in this in that race. But what was I think so different at the time was it was nationalized in the sense that there was a major party primary kind of happening at the same time. And I think Hillary Clinton unwisely came in and said something about Joanne Kloppenburg that we obviously took advantage of. Joanne Kloppenburg ran against Rebecca Bradley, for our listeners that weren't around 10 years ago. But like partially because Walker appointed Bradley, I think that made it far more, and he was governor. And I think the issues Walker was advancing were just more discussed. It was still 2016 was a more local discussion about Wisconsin issues, where I think 2025 was just like how do you feel about Doge today? And I just think it's just such a departure over the last 10 years.
Yeah, that last bit, Pat, sort of reflects something that's happened since 2017. Brian talked about lower turnout elections. The spring elections are lower turnout. The midterm elections, legislative races, in gubernatorial races, lower turnout than the presidential election. For a long time, that was thought to benefit Republicans. Right now, if you start in 2017 and you look at the statewide races for governor, senator, Supreme Court justice, attorney general, these are statewide races. The Republican or conservative coded candidates, and Supreme Court justices don't run as members of parties, has lost 10 out of 12 times. 10 out of 12 times. And I think one of the things that's happened is that these races have, become a referendum on Trump and a device to spur the resistance to vote, right? The people who are really riled up and upset about Donald Trump, get them out to vote. And so appeals are made in these races that have nothing to do, particularly at the state Supreme Court level, that have nothing to do with Donald Trump. I mean, the state Supreme Court really doesn't have much to do with, Donald Trump and the things that Donald Trump does. They can't stop tariffs. They can't stop the enforcement of immigration law. They can't do anything about any of that stuff. But yet this becomes the motivating tools that are used to drive turnout. And so far, at least in the state Supreme Court races in particular, the conservative coded candidates not winning that. They haven't figured out how to do it. I think they tried in the last race where, Schimmel kind of embraced Trump and Musk in a way that, hadn't been tried before. And it did increase turnout. I mean, Schimmel got more votes than most candidates that lose state Supreme Court races. He got 1 million votes. 1 million votes most years would be enough to win one of these races. Not this year, not even close. He lost by 10 points.
Really good context. And Brian, if you want to respond, I just think I want to make a note here. It's true. And like 1 million votes that Brad Schimmel got in most of these races in the last, 10 years would have been a victory.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The other thing that goes on with these races, and this makes it a little bit of a roller coaster for political observers, is that some of the races happen in the absence of a big national thing going on. Some of them happen right in the middle of it. When I say national thing going on, what I'm talking about is something nationally that's going to affect turnout in some big way, one way or another. And in the case of Schimmel, what we saw, I think, is that the left was having a very big reaction to the reelection of Donald Trump in 2024, right? So the president won in 2024. That meant that the next chance that liberal voters had to have their voice heard, which in Wisconsin was that spring Supreme Court race, they were going to come out in droves. And so that meant that Brad Schimmel can get, 1 million votes, something that will be really, it is a really good vote get, and it would be enough to win in other years. Suddenly isn't enough because there's this massive influx of liberal money, energy, and voters because they're reacting to what happened in the last political cycle. We saw that benefit the right at different times in the past as well. And the other thing that can happen is sometimes you'll have a presidential primary right up on top of a race. That happened in the Bradley race we talked about in 2016. Rebecca Bradley won that race for many reasons, including what a good candidate she was. But also something that helped was that there was a Republican primary going on. It brought more voters into that. That also benefited. What year was that? That was
16.
Yeah, 2016.
Yeah,
Because
2016.
Ted Cruz and Donald Trump were actually going at it, and I think Walker endorsed Cruz at the time. Walker was
That's right.
campaigning Cruz all over the state. They were juicing turnout. Rebecca Bradley was able to just talk about it or just
That's
be
right.
there, kind of.
And then the year that happened in reverse was 2020. Joe Karofsky really benefited when she beat Dan Kelly.
Yes.
She really benefited from the fact that we had a Democratic presidential primary still going on. There was even rumors, there was intrigue that Bernie Sanders stayed in the race, was convinced by Wisconsin Democrats to stay in the race long enough to keep that primary active, right? So it would benefit Joe Karofsky. So, sometimes these different reasons for waves can be a little bit unique as well.
This wasn't a question I necessarily thought of asking yet, but are voters in Wisconsin just completely fine with how political these races have? I think Wisconsin we are a battleground state. We've had competitive races many times, many statewide. Not we love politics in Wisconsin. I think that's like some feedback I think we get often. And so are voters just perfectly okay with how political these have become? Maybe except Rick and a couple of people on this Zoom, but I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
There's an ethos that lawyers have about how judges are supposed to act. So there are slurs that lawyers can lob at judges. It's a problem if you're an activist judge. It's a problem if you're results oriented. It's a problem if you are the term that we often use, and Pat, I'm sure you've heard it around Will a lot. It's a problem if lawyers say about a judge, oh, she's just making it up, right? Because there's this idea that you should be applying some set of principles that are not your own, that are derived, that somebody else has approved, the legislature has approved, the Constitution has approved. They're not your own, and you're not applying them. You're not expressing your own preferences. This is one of the reasons why, judges often refer to themselves in the third person as the court, or they wear black, nondescript judges, because it's not supposed to be that person who's up there. It's supposed to be somebody who is, simply discerning the law. As I said, there's been a move away from that on the legal left. They tend to see it a little bit differently. Voters don't care about that stuff at all, right? They want to know, whether or not, somebody's going to be tough on crime, or whether they're going to vote for or against abortion rights, that type of thing. And so a lot of this arguments that somebody like me would make about, the importance of the separation of powers and, the importance that each branch of government stay within its remit. Those are things that are harder to sell to voters because they're just not socialized to think of things that way. Some do, but a lot don't.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but there is a part of me that has a alternative view, and maybe it's a Pollyanna-ish part maybe it's just a piece of hope, which is, we've had times in our history where politics has been more and less polarized, and so there is a pendulum that swings, and I wonder, I don't know when it is, but I wonder, you do hear people say they're fed up with getting more and more politicized, and often people are saying that while casting votes that help create things to be more politicized because they're living their lives. They got their kids
100%.
to get off to school. They got to get to the grocery store. They're not here dissecting all this stuff. And the reality is that people are simultaneously voting one way and also frustrated at how our system is turning out. I just wonder, is there a point where the pendulum swings so far that people want to see a judiciary that's a little bit more independent again? Maybe I'm wrong about that. I guess I think maybe it would get worse before it gets better, and we'd have to have a lot more voter turnout so that it goes beyond the base of both parties. But part of me wonders, maybe slash hopes, that there's a world where voters help correct things. And I think voters do help correct things over time. It's just maybe hard to see sometimes.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that Pollyannish. I mean, I think that politics is a little bit like the weather in Wisconsin. If you don't like it, just wait. It'll
That's fair.
change. And I think that's right. I to some degree, I think maybe we're getting to that point now where more voters are going to tend to take on the persona of, a parent who's just can't stand it that the children are fighting. Don't even care who's right, who's wrong. Just knock it off, okay? Maybe we'll get to something like that, and that could certainly affect the way that judicial elections come out. That this type of, I was used to joke about, because I know a lot of lawyers, I know a lot of people that run for judge, and then they start making commercials about them, and there's these sort of sepia toned where somebody is sort of made to look as ugly as they possibly can, and call them and tell them to stop letting child molesters run free. And I don't even, these are not the people I know. They're not like that. And it may be the voters will get sick of that to a greater degree.
In the short term though, that's like I think the way these elections are conducted like really discourage people from running for Congress. And we talked about this a little bit with Reed Ribble, our last episode, is like, who wants to sign up for this at this
Yeah.
point? Like it's kind of like you'd be a great justice on the Supreme Court. It's like, yeah, but like I don't want to run equivalent, be the equivalent of running for governor, raise millions of dollars and campaign all over the state and like have to do all these interviews and a bus tour. I mean that's where we're heading, right? And so one of the things I do want to, like we've talked about, like maybe when the temperature cools down, it's like how can we kind of bring some of this back into the way it should go, right? Where we just are electing kind of qualified people, and maybe this can encourage people to run if we change the process a little bit. So I want to talk through a couple solutions. The first one is if we were to have an election in November, if we move April, if we go back to what we go back on the April thing and bring it back to November, as a way to kind of increase voter participation, would that be helpful, less or more?
I'll take a crack at that, and I'll give an answer that's going to leave a ripe target for anybody that wants to take a shot at it from different directions. I think that one of the ups it's a double-edged sword, and one of the upsides of this would be that because November has higher turnout, you're going to have more voters, speaking in the Supreme Court elections, right? We talk about how that low turnout means you have the base voters from the left and the right driving, more partisan views in the middle of a race that's supposed to be less partisan, at least on paper. So moving into November, one of the arguments is, hey, you're going to have a bigger slice of the electorate, more people having a say. The flip side, though, is that November is already so politicized, so partisan, so nationalized, right? I mean, those folks that Rick was talking about, a century ago or so, who decided that they needed to move the election out of November to spring. There's a certain logic to it if you think about the fact that, is there any less, or is there any more partisan of a time than November of an even numbered year? So is the answer to move the Supreme Court election into November? I think that's kind of an argument. Not. What I would say is, because of that double-edged sword, I would look for a little bit of a third way, which is I think we need to keep it in spring and we need to have a more engaged electorate. Wisconsin has a very strong, active conservative movement, a very strong, active liberal movement. And also, we've got an independent streak in there. Even though it's less than it used to be, there's more split ticket voters in Wisconsin than there are other states. There's a good slice of independent swing voters. And so, if there was a way to have a spring election where we drove more turnout, not only on a partisan basis, that would really be the answer to me. But there's certainly merits and demerits to moving in November. And, if it gets bad enough, maybe it's worth trying anything, I guess.
I don't know. I mean, obviously the concern was, well, we have it in November, it's going to become more partisan. That seems like a quaint concern now. I mean, it's going to become
Yeah.
more partisan. I don't know that it could become more partisan. So, maybe if you keep it in the spring, you still you will have people focusing on this race. But I mean, I think that there are dynamics within the sort of populist turn of the Republican Party which are affecting these races. The Republicans, at least at this point, have they basically have traded support among very reliable voters for support among less reliable voters. This hurts them now in low turnout races. All of this business about the SAVE Act and voter fraud and voter suppression, and it's kind of amusing to me because um, I think Republicans are helped by high turnout in a way that they weren't helped before. I'm not so much concerned about the level of turnout as whether or not people can focus on the issues that are presented by the office that they're voting upon. And this is, I think, maybe really Pollyannish to think that, maybe people could come to see that even beyond the demands of civility and sort of cooperation, that these races really shouldn't be about politics. They shouldn't be about. There is a conservative and a liberal element to them. I mean, when people, I know that a lot of lawyers that get upset when you talk about conservative judges or progressive judges. I think even within the framework that where I think judges should be acting, there is a difference, right? There are different ways of interpretation that I think sort of track with those political differences, but nevertheless, it's different. And I would hope, and this is Pollyannish, that we would find some way to focus voters on that and not simply about getting what they want. Like you ought not to have a Chris Taylor running saying that she's going to fight for these people or fight for those people. That's not her job. That's for the legislature. The legislature fights for different group of people. Judges are supposed to be about something different.
That gets at something that we've hinted at a little bit, which is kind of the changing composition of these races too. You look back at 2016 when Rebecca Bradley won. The coalition she won with was kind of at the time the traditional conservative coalition, right? Whereas the Southeast Wisconsin suburbs, some strength in rural areas for sure, and then the Democrats really had the urban areas. And now that is all so different. The suburbs have drifted, not entirely, but drifted toward the left. And Republicans have really, to Rick's point on turnout, the reason turnout has become so important, one of the reasons is because Republicans are trying to squeeze as many votes out of rural areas as they possibly can. Those areas are not growing like urban areas are. And so they have to activate as many of those voters as possible. And something President Trump has been good at, whether his opponents like it or not, is getting more and more people from rural areas to vote in 2024. Every single traditional rural county had a higher vote count in terms of the raw vote and in terms of the percentage vote, even though supposedly that rural vote had been maxed out, and even though the Democrats with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz made the biggest play for rural areas in a generation. They didn't do a very good job of it, but they made the biggest play in a generation. So the reason I bring that up is I've thought a lot about rural voters, particularly in the course of my book, Land Rich Cash Poor, where we look at what's going on economically with the rural voters. I think both parties, this is a little outside of the scope of the Supreme Court discussion, but I think it's relevant because it's affecting things. Both parties, both the conservative and the liberal movement, need to get their heads around what's going on with rural voters. They are so frustrated with the economic status quo for decades now that satisfying them on that level is very difficult. And so it's actually very easy to appeal to those voters on other frustrations that they have. And then the left is appealing to urban voters with the frustrations they have about the conservative movement or about President Trump. And everybody's ricocheting off of one another here in a way that I think animates a lot of the issues that Rick is talking about. And all of a sudden we have all these superfluous things. It really doesn't matter what the legal issues of the day are, or the qualifications of the judge are. It's, as Pat said, what do you think of Doge? I mean, that sums it up as well as anything, right? That was the latest outrage of the moment that the two sides were ricocheting off of each other on, because ultimately our political system isn't fully satisfying the needs and desires of some groups of people, rural voters being one of them, but not the only one.
One of the things I thought of when we were talking about, just in the context of rural voters too, is like increasing representation might be just, that's where I was getting at with the November solution. If there's a way, like we have, a court of our appeals or the court of appeals in Wisconsin are broken down by districts. Could we create districts that we elect Supreme Court candidates from? And obviously, we're not going to get into how those will be drawn. I think, whether they're drawn a certain way or not, but like in theory, it would increase rural representation. One of the things I think we talk about a lot is like, the Supreme Court, whatever issue they tackle, it's like sometimes it's not always brought down to like how this really impacts a certain community or not. But if we had rural, just district representation, urban, suburban, rural representation could all be included. I don't know what do you guys think about that?
Oh, I hate it. I mean, and here's why: judges aren't representatives, and I think that there are real dangers in having judges who are beholden to sub-constituencies, like to rural voters, to urban voters. I think of years ago. I was involved in I think I was Brian's age. I was involved in a judicial voting rights case in Milwaukee County, and the NAACP wanted Milwaukee County to be split into judicial districts so that they could elect more Black judges. And I represented the Wisconsin Trial Judges Association, and they hated it. And the reason they hated it is that they didn't want to be put in a position where, I remember one guy who would have been representing a suburban district, and he said, I don't want to be put in a position where, I got to preside over a trial of a Black kid from the inner city, and I decide that, I got to exclude some evidence, or maybe on sentencing, I think that this kid deserves a break. And then I got to go back and explain that to my voters who don't identify with this kid at all. 4 districts, fine for the Court of Appeals. I'm not even sure I'm wed to that. But, if you're going to have statewide jurisdiction, you ought to be elected statewide, I think.
One thing that I think and hope could help with this is just the notion of, if the left and the right can get their heads around the political alignment that we've been talking about that's been going on, and start to better satisfy the needs of the voters. I think all the forces that we're talking about are also fed by just the level of frustration that people have. And so if we don't want judges broken down into more specific constituencies, which is a point that I can understand, I think part of the challenge that we have is that we're electing them statewide, but we kind of are breaking them down to constituencies. Like at this point, it's kind of like the conservative candidate better be pretty dang well aligned with how ticked off, whatever rural voters are frustrated about, plus those folks in the exurbs and those folks in the wild counties that are still rock-ribbed enough in their minds to remain conservative voters. It's getting to be narrower and narrower groups on the right, and then on the left as well. I mean, they're geared as much as they possibly can be around the most urban of urban concerns, and so I don't know, maybe this is one of those things where the voters are really the only ones that can solve this. More voters getting more engaged, more voters being frustrated with how partisan it's getting, to the point that we were making earlier before. I'm glad Rick didn't think that was too Pollyanna-ish. But
no, I was the one who was being Pollyanna.
Well, maybe we're agreeing that there's room for a little bit of Pollyanna brought back.
There ought to be. There always should be.
Yeah, there's room for her.
The one solution we haven't talked about yet, and this is where the scenario is like, we have a pretty center right or center left, but more moderate governor take office. The legislature is kind of 50-50. And it creates a scenario where we just reform, or if we can, change how we start picking judges and kick off a constitutional process that would allow, the power to not actually go by election anymore. And while we know that might not be popular with voters in this exact moment, but like, is there a benefit if a governor would appoint a Supreme Court justice and a state Senate would ratify it, or just however, there's other solutions, out there that's more of an appointment driven and not an election driven. That Rick, maybe that's something you support more than breaking districts down or the state by district.
Yeah, I mean, nothing's perfect. Appointment versus election versus sort of nonpartisan commissions. I'm very suspicious of nonpartisan commissions because I think what happens with nonpartisan commissions is they're still partisan. You just can't see it. It's all driven underground, and there's no accountability. I think that, if you can appoint people, there are certain partisan aspects to that. There's been some research showing that, you do tend to get people who have higher paper qualifications if you appoint them, because that becomes a bigger part of the appointment process. We could argue about whether that leads to better service or not, but we're going to elect judges in Wisconsin. That is just absolute. The voters have no interest,
Yeah.
at least they haven't to date, have no interest in changing that.
In the hypothetical situation where there was a change, I do think that gubernatorial appointments are maybe the best balance of the different factors, and Rick described them, right? I mean, we know how partisan the elections are. On the flip side, as Rick said, nonpartisan commissions, it's so easy for those commissions to still be manipulated on a partisan level, and the public doesn't see it. When you have a governor, kind of like similar to when you have a president, it's like, hey, you're electing a governor, and one of the things you're doing when you vote for that person is you're saying that you're okay with them making appointments to the highest court in the state, right? And we have seen, I think, on the federal level, and I think there are examples of this in states that do appointments too, where there are justices that don't decide cases in alignment with the person who appointed them all the time. It's famous. It happens all the time. It happened in this past session, right? I mean, it happens all the time. And so having an executive who's elected and accountable to people do an appointment for someone who kind of at some point doesn't have to totally care what that person thinks every single day about every single issue is probably the right balance if we had a chance to get there. And this, by the way, doesn't have to mean that any of these people who are voting and who are doing it based on their political principles. I don't think any of us are saying that people on the right who are concerned about these issues needs to be any less animated or any less attached to their principles. I think what we're talking about is that there's value from a constitutional standpoint, from a founding this country standpoint, to having a judiciary that's independent as a check. And that's a a crucial part of a republic and a crucial part of liberty, kind of whatever your politics are. So I just don't want people out there, listeners out there, to think that this means that you can't be sticking to your guns politically. There's value, whatever your politics are, to having an independent judiciary on some level.
At the Supreme Court level, like a vacancy is a highly political moment in the time of the country, like we've seen. And I almost like, it's almost like that's enough politics into the situation, and then we get the judge, and then honestly, like they don't just rule, as you noted, 100% in lockstep with however the appointment process would indicate that they did. I think it would be probably the most ideal solution, but as Rick said, we would just never get there.
During the COVID pandemic, we did a lot of litigation addressing some of the things that the governor had done in response to it. And our arguments were almost never that the particular thing that you did was bad, like the, mask mandate or restricted hours or whatever it was that was done. It was that you did it the wrong way. Once the initial emergency that required immediate action had passed, it was time to return to regular constitutional order so that everybody would have some input into what type of things were done and not done. And you would have maximal public buy-in to that. And that you shouldn't, I don't know how many times I found myself in the media saying, look, even if you like what the current governor is doing, you want these restrictions to be in place. You want these limitations on his authority to be in place, because I can guarantee you there will be a governor in the future who you do not like, because there are no permanent victories in politics. We see that now. Everything is flipped, right? Where conservatives who were once sort of death on executive and administrative authority are willing to look the other way now that their guy is in power. But again, I would say that's short-sighted, because there will be a president and an administration in the future that you're not, and they're not going to want to have that president and that administration have this type of authority. So this requires a longer term perspective, but again, maybe this is Pollyannish, but I don't think it's impossible.
Perfect segue, I think, to our final segment of this podcast, which is, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And so, Brian, I'm sure you read that we do ask this question, and appreciate you being prepared ahead of time. Why don't we start with you? If there's a moment, and it could be related to this, it doesn't have to be, but if there's a moment in history that you think we as Americans, as a country, are doomed to repeat, what is it?
Yeah, well, I'll just say I've got a bigger one, but a quick little appetizer is I think that in Wisconsin, the left is going to, be doomed to repeat what the right faced in the Wisconsin Supreme Court majority, right? At one time, Republicans had the governor's mansion, the legislature, and the Supreme Court. And it's very, very, very hard to defend that majority over time because people just begin to feel comfortable with the fact that it's there and they're not as animated as those people who want to flip it, right? And so I think that we'll see at some point that the liberal majority in the Supreme Court will change, as Rick said. I like to say that politics is fluid always. It just is a matter of kind of when. So, but my bigger one is actually it gets a little bit off the beaten track, but I think it has a lot to do with the issues of civil society that you guys are talking about here, which is I think we're doomed to repeat too big to fail in some form or fashion. I don't mean just banking, but people remember, in 2008, we were worried about whether or not the failure of banks meant there wasn't going to be any cash coming out the ATM. We have so many industries that have so many of those kinds of problems. And I think that we've got a world where that kind of crisis economically will continue to happen in one form or fashion in big and small ways. And the reason I think that's important in this discussion is because the more frustrated people are economically, the more people feel like they don't have economic agency in a capitalist society, the harder it is for people to have faith in democracy. If you don't feel like you've got any control over what's going on with your pocketbook, you don't have a whole lot of faith in whether it matters when you go to the ballot box. And so I think that matters. I think it matters in a world where we want to have elections that function properly, where we want to have people appreciating that the independent judiciary is an appropriate check on the executive and the legislature, those kinds of things. We want to have those kinds of discussions. You got to have people feeling like they're not getting screwed economically. So that might be a little bit of a kind of, like I say, off the beaten path topic, but I think that people's economic frustration feeds directly into the kind of overheated elections that we're talking about here.
Fantastic point. No, it's great. Rick, what about you?
Well, I think maybe a bit smaller and maybe more related to what we've talked about here. So, the left had a majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court in the early aughts, and they overstepped their bounds. They issued a series of decisions which sort of quaintly would not be regarded as like really controversial, as controversial, I think, as some of the things that we see today. The people on the right, the legal right, mobilized against that. Diane Sykes gave a famous lecture at Marquette. Mike Brennan, who's down on the Seventh Circuit, did some things. I did some things, published some stuff. And eventually the court flipped because we have this problem in the United States. When people get power, they think that the appropriate response to having that power is to use it to, cram whatever they want down the other side's throat, to sort of engage in maximal, use of power, and it tends to backfire against them. And we're seeing a lot of that now, even in things where, the Trump administration used to have a great advantage on immigration. Immigration was a great issue for the Trump administration in the 2024 election. He's now 10 points underwater on it because he went too far. And according to the Wall Street Journal reporting on Friday, he realizes he went too far. He blames somebody else, of course, but he wants that to be changed, right? He doesn't want any of this mass deportation stuff anymore. And it was predictable that if you did that stuff would happen that would look really bad on television and people wouldn't like. And I suspect that the majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court is getting prepared to do the same thing. And if they start issuing decisions which raise people's taxes, that further balkanize the state, I just think that there's going to be a price that has to be paid by that. But I do agree with Brian's point that, I'm a very much a free market guy, but people have to think they have a stake in the system, right? And if they don't think they have a stake in the system, if they think it's not for them, their support eventually deteriorates.
Eventually, when we get into a couple other episodes that we have planned, it's going to be, AI in the workforce, AI and energy and things like that. And I think that will get into some of the stuff that Rick just brought up too. Well, Brian, thanks again for joining us. Thanks for your time.
Hey, this is an ambitious podcast. I mean, the ideas and the issues you guys are tackling are huge. I say go take on AI. I can't wait to hear it.
Well, thanks again, guys. And thanks again to all our listeners, and keep up with us. Like I hinted at, we have some new topics coming soon, so stay tuned.